The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Bridges, one of those suburban neighborhoods where nothing ever seemed to happen. But for Boone Calloway, a 34-year-old man who had long since adapted to a world of darkness, this day would change everything. Walking with steady steps, his right hand gripped his white cane while his left held onto the harness of his loyal guide dog, Sable. The German shepherd moved with precise confidence, leading Boone as he had for years since losing his sight at 17 in a devastating accident. Sable had been more than just a service dog. He was Boone's lifeline, his family, his protector. The sudden screech of tires shattered the peaceful afternoon. A police cruiser came to an abrupt stop just a few feet away, and within seconds a tall, broad-shouldered officer with sharp blue eyes and a stern expression stepped out. His badge gleamed in the sunlight as he adjusted his belt, his hand resting dangerously close to his holstered gun. His name, Officer Zane Whitaker. Without hesitation, his voice rang out with firm authority. "Hey, step away from that dog now." Boone's head snapped in the direction of the voice. His grip tightened on Sable's harness, and his pulse quickened. He had faced discrimination before, but there was something about the officer's tone that sent a chill down his spine. "Excuse me, is there a problem, officer?" Boone asked, keeping his voice calm. "That dog belongs to the police department. Where did you steal him?" Zane snapped. Boone's brows furrowed in disbelief. "Stole." His fingers curled protectively around the harness. "This is my guide dog. I'm blind." But Zane wasn't listening. He took a step forward, his expression unreadable. Before Boone could react, the officer yanked Sable's harness out of his hand. "I said let go. This dog is coming with me." The air was thick with tension. Boone stumbled slightly, disoriented. His world, suddenly more chaotic than ever, seemed to spiral out of control. He reached out instinctively, but Sable had already been pulled away. The shepherd let out a confused whine, his ears pinned back as he looked between his owner and the officer. Neighbors started gathering, whispers spreading like wildfire. One woman, standing barefoot on her lawn, took a step forward. It was Izzy Fairbanks, a fiery redhead in her mid-50s, who had known Boone for years. She immediately recognized the injustice unfolding before her eyes. "Officer, that dog belongs to him. Boone's been blind for over a decade. Sable is his guide," she protested. Zane barely spared her a glance. With a cold expression, he opened the back door of the squad car and shoved Sable inside. The sound of the door slamming shut felt like a punch to Boone's gut. "If this dog is really yours, you can prove it at the station. Otherwise, he's being taken to the department's K-9 unit," Zane said. Boone stood frozen, his hands trembling, his chest tightening. Fury and helplessness mixed in a sickening wave. His world, already cloaked in darkness, felt even more suffocating without Sable by his side. But Zane Whitaker had no idea who he was messing with, because Boone Calloway wasn't just any man. He was the son of Garrison Calloway, one of the most powerful judges in the state. And when the truth came out, Officer Whitaker would regret this day for the rest of his life. Boone stood motionless on the sidewalk, his fingers twitching at his sides. His breath was uneven. Sable was gone, and the absence of his guide dog left an unbearable void, as if the last thread of stability in his world had been severed. He wanted to yell, to demand that Officer Whitaker bring his dog back, but he knew it would be useless. Fighting with a cop on the street wouldn't help him. But Boone Calloway wasn't just another man. His pulse pounded in his ears as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers instinctively found the right contact, and he pressed the call button with firm resolve. The line rang twice before a deep, composed voice answered. "Boone, everything all right?" Boone exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. It was Garrison Calloway, his father, a man feared and respected in equal measure, a federal judge with a reputation for tearing apart corrupt officers in courtrooms. Their relationship had always been complicated, filled with long silences and unspoken disappointments. But one thing was certain. His father did not tolerate injustice. "Dad, I need your help. A cop just took Sable. Said I stole him. He wouldn't listen. Wouldn't even let me explain." Silence stretched between them. Then his father's voice dropped into something calm, controlled, and ice cold. "What's the officer's name?" Boone swallowed hard, feeling the shift in tone. His father was already in courtroom mode, the same voice he used when preparing to dismantle a prosecutor's case with surgical precision. "Whitaker, Zane Whitaker." A rustling of papers came through the receiver. Boone could picture his father sitting at his desk, already pulling up legal records, already setting things in motion. "Which precinct?" "I don't know." Another brief pause. Then his father spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "Go home. Boone, do not go to the station. Do not call anyone else. I'll handle this." Boone wanted to argue, wanted to be there when they forced Whitaker to admit his mistake. But before he could protest, the call ended. The silence that followed was crushing. He gritted his teeth, a fresh wave of frustration washing over him. Boone had never liked being sidelined, but deep down he knew his father was right. A gentle but firm hand landed on his shoulder. The scent of floral perfume and fresh coffee drifted toward him. He didn't need to see to know who it was. "Come inside, Boone. You shouldn't be alone right now." It was Izzy Fairbanks. She had always been more than just a neighbor, one of the few people in this town who had always treated him with patience and kindness, even when others saw him as nothing more than a burden. Boone hesitated, his pride warring with his exhaustion. But standing outside alone in a world without Sable was unbearable. Finally, he gave a small nod as Izzy guided him toward her front porch. Boone had no idea that at that very moment, Judge Garrison Calloway was making a call of his own, one that would shake the entire police department to its core. Inside her cozy but cluttered living room, Izzy guided Boone to the couch and placed a warm cup of tea in his hands. He wasn't in the mood for tea, but the simple gesture grounded him, kept his hands from shaking. His thoughts were spiraling. Was Sable scared? Did he think Boone had abandoned him? The very thought made his chest tighten. Boone had spent years learning to navigate a world without sight, but the idea of doing it without Sable? That was impossible. Meanwhile, across town inside a sleek glass panel office at the Bridges Courthouse, Judge Garrison Calloway sat at his massive oak desk, phone pressed firmly to his ear, his expression unreadable. But the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. The person on the other end of the line, Police Chief EMT Harlow, had no idea what was about to hit him. "EMT, I assume you know why I'm calling." Garrison's voice was sharp, controlled, but there was no anger, only a deliberate, cutting precision. The police chief, a man in his late 50s with a career built on carefully maintaining peace, cleared his throat. "Garrison, I just heard about the situation." "Then you already know your officer made a grave mistake," Garrison interrupted. There was no hint of emotion, just a kind of sharpness that made seasoned prosecutors sweat in courtrooms. Chief Harlow pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling slowly. "Look, I understand your frustration, but there are procedures. Don't patronize me, EMT. You and I both know that Officer Whitaker had no probable cause to seize my son's dog. He acted out of arrogance and ignorance, and I expect immediate corrective action." The chief fell silent. He had worked with Garrison long enough to know that when the judge demanded something, he expected results. Back at Izzy's house, Boone sat in near silence, occasionally sipping his tea, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his knee. He was used to waiting, used to patience, but this was different. Every minute that passed without Sable felt like another crack forming in his foundation. Finally, the silence was broken by the distant sound of a car pulling up outside. Izzy moved toward the window, peeking through the blinds. "Boone, you're not going to believe this." Before he could respond, a firm knock on the front door echoed through the house. Boone turned his head toward the sound, his pulse quickening. On the other side of that door stood Officer Zane Whitaker, and he was about to realize just how badly he had screwed up. The knock was sharp, deliberate, a sound that sent a wave of tension through Boone's chest. He straightened slightly, gripping the fabric of his jeans. His mind raced. Was Sable with them? Had they heard him? He forced himself to take a steady breath. Izzy walked to the door, hesitated for only a moment, and pulled it open. Standing on the porch was Officer Zane Whitaker, but gone was the arrogance from earlier. His posture was rigid, his expression tight, and there was an unmistakable discomfort in his eyes. Beside him stood Police Chief E.M.T. Harlow, a grizzled man with silver-streaked hair and the exhausted look of someone who had spent years putting out fires in his department. Boone could hear the weight in the chief's sigh before he even spoke. "Mr. Calloway, we're here to return your dog and formally apologize for what happened today." Boone's hands tightened into fists, his heart pounding in his ears. "Sable." He swallowed hard before speaking, his voice calm but laced with restrained anger. "And where is he?" Whitaker shifted uncomfortably before stepping aside. A moment later, Boone heard the familiar clicking of paws on pavement, the soft jingle of Sable's collar, and then a whine. Boone barely had time to brace himself before Sable pressed into his legs. His warm breath hit Boone's hands as he nudged him desperately, whining again. A sharp breath left Boone's chest as he sank to his knees, his hands moving over Sable's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Relief flooded through him like a wave. He was safe. He was here. Chief Harlow cleared his throat. "Judge Calloway made it very clear that what happened today was unacceptable. Officer Whitaker has been formally reprimanded and will undergo additional training regarding service animals and disability protocols." Boone barely reacted. He kept his focus on Sable, his fingers gripping the dog's harness like an anchor. Finally, after a long moment, he turned his head slightly toward Whitaker. The officer exhaled through his nose before speaking. His voice was tight. "I was wrong." The words sounded like they took effort to say. "I assumed something about you without looking at the facts. I shouldn't have treated you like a suspect. I should have listened." Boone let the words settle before nodding once. His grip on Sable's harness remained firm. "Don't do it again." Whitaker gave a short, tight nod. The tension in the air was thick, but Boone didn't care. He had his dog back. That was all that mattered. But before the officers could leave, Boone straightened and spoke again. "I want to speak at the precinct." Chief Harlow frowned slightly. "About what?" "What it's like to live in a world that isn't made for people like me. About what happened today and how to make sure it doesn't happen again." Boone's voice was steady. "Your officers need to hear it from someone who actually knows." A pause. Then the chief nodded slowly. "I can arrange that." Whitaker said nothing. Boone didn't care. As the officers left, he ran his fingers through Sable's fur, feeling the warmth of his presence. He hadn't just gotten his dog back today. He had made sure no one else would have to fight the same battle. The fluorescent lights in the Bridges Police Department's conference room buzzed faintly as Boone sat at the head of the long table. His fingers rested on Sable's harness, feeling the steady breathing beneath his palm. He wasn't intimidated by the rows of uniformed officers sitting before him, though he could sense their skepticism. Some arms were crossed. Others leaned back in their chairs, exuding quiet resistance. They didn't think they needed to be here. Boone had heard it all before. The dismissive tone, the unwillingness to acknowledge that a mistake had been made. But today, he would make them listen. He took a slow breath and spoke. "I want to start with a question." His voice was even deliberate. "How many of you have ever thought about what it's like to be blind? Not just for a moment, but to actually live in complete darkness every second of every day." The room remained silent. Boone allowed the pause to linger before continuing. "How many of you know what it's like to have people assume you're incapable, or worse, a threat? To have an officer take away your independence because he didn't bother to ask a single question?" His words hung heavy in the air. A few officers exchanged glances. Others remained still. Boone didn't need to see their faces to know that some were uncomfortable. Good. They should be. His grip on Sable's harness tightened as he continued. 3 days ago, an officer of this department decided that my guide dog, my lifeline, didn't belong to me. He took him without cause, without evidence, and without considering what that meant for me. He turned his head slightly toward Officer Zane Whitaker, who sat stiffly 2 seats away. Boone couldn't see his expression, but he could feel the tension rolling off him. Chief E.M.T. Harlow, seated at the far end of the table, leaned forward. "Boone, what do you believe needs to change?" His tone was measured, serious. Boone had expected this question. In fact, he had been waiting for it. He squared his shoulders. "Real training. Not just a slide presentation, not just a pamphlet. Officers need to understand how to approach situations involving people with disabilities, how to ask questions before making assumptions, how to recognize that taking away someone's guide dog is the same as taking away their ability to function in the world. His voice hardened slightly. Because next time it might not be me. It might be someone without a father who's a judge, and they won't have anyone to fight for them. Another silence filled the room, heavier than before. Boone could tell some officers were beginning to reconsider their stance, starting to understand, even if only a little, what he had lost that day. Finally, Chief Harlow nodded. "You're right." His gaze swept across the room. "This department needs to do better, and it will." Boone exhaled slowly, releasing some of the weight he had carried for the past 3 days. He hadn't come here for an apology. He had come here for change, and judging by the look on Chief Harlow's face, that change had already begun. What a powerful scene. Boone hadn't just spoken. He had made everyone feel the weight of his words. "Now, I want to hear your opinion. Do you think the officer responsible should face consequences beyond training, or is changing the approach enough?" "Comment below?" Boone stepped out of the Bridges Police Department's conference room, feeling the weight of the past few days finally begin to ease. The meeting had gone better than expected, not because the officers suddenly understood his struggles, but because they had listened. Some had left the room thoughtful, others still skeptical. But one thing was certain. They would think twice before making the same mistake again. Sable walked beside him, his movement steady, his presence grounding Boone in a way nothing else could. Izzy was waiting for him in the lobby, arms crossed, watching the officers filter out of the room. When she spotted Boone, she let out a breath she'd probably been holding since he walked in there. "Well?" she asked, falling into step beside him as he moved toward the exit. "They listened," Boone said simply. He scoffed. "Yeah, well, they should have. You basically handed them their own ignorance on a silver platter." Boone could hear the pride in her voice, even as she tried to hide it behind sarcasm. He just shook his head, smirking slightly. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about making sure this doesn't happen again. As they stepped outside, the warm afternoon sun pressed against Boone's skin, a stark contrast to the cold tension he felt inside that conference room. He stopped for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. It was strange how quickly things had changed. Just days ago, he had been standing on a sidewalk helpless, as a Whitaker ripped Sable away from him. Now, that same officer had sat in silence, while Boone explained exactly why his actions had been so unforgivable. "So, what now?" Izzy asked after a moment. Boone tilted his head slightly, reaching down to scratch behind Sable's ears. "Now!" He exhaled slowly, his grip on the harness firm but no longer desperate. "I go home, and for the first time in days, I don't have to wonder if I'll be able to walk down the street without my best friend." Sable let out a soft huff, pressing against his leg, as if to say he wasn't going anywhere. Boone smiled. "And that's enough for me." Boone had barely settled back into his routine when the consequences of his speech at the police department started rippling through Bridges. The first sign came when his father called him the next morning. Garrison Calloway wasn't a man prone to small talk, so when Boone answered, he immediately recognized the weight in his father's voice. "You've made an impression, Boone." Boone frowned, running a hand over Sable's fur as the dog lay stretched beside him. "Good or bad? Depends on who you ask." His father sighed. "Chief Harlow is pushing for a full department-wide training program on disability awareness. That's the good part. But..." Boone's grip on the phone tightened at the name. He's filed a formal complaint, claiming he was unfairly targeted and publicly humiliated." Boone let out a humorless laugh. "Publicly humiliated? He took my dog in front of an entire neighborhood, treated me like a criminal, and now he wants to play the victim?" "I told Harlow the complaint wouldn't go anywhere," Garrison continued. "But you should know that not everyone in that room was happy to hear what you had to say. Some officers think you were trying to make an example out of them." Boone sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was trying to make sure no one else goes through what I did." His father was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I know that, and so does anyone who actually listened. But people in power don't like being told they're wrong. Boone could hear the unspoken warning in his father's voice. He hadn't set out to make enemies, but it seemed that some officers in Bridges PD now saw him as one. As he hung up the call, Boone rested a hand on Sable's back, feeling the dog's steady breathing. He had won the battle, but the war wasn't over yet. The tension in Bridges was shifting, and Boone could feel it. Ever since his speech at the police department, something had changed. People were talking. Some praised him for standing up for himself, while others, especially those in law enforcement, weren't so supportive. Boone knew that change didn't come without resistance, but he hadn't expected it to feel so personal. The first incident was subtle. Boone was walking Sable through town when he noticed how quiet the street had become. Normally, people greeted him, shop owners, neighbors, even kids playing on the sidewalks. But now there was a hesitation, a distance that hadn't been there before. A few voices hushed when he passed, and though he couldn't see their expressions, he could feel the stares. Word had spread. Then came the real trouble, a letter, no return address, shoved under his front door. Boone ran his fingers over the paper before reading it aloud to Izzy later that evening. Stay in your lane, Calloway. You made enough noise already. Next time, it won't just be your dog they take. Izzy nearly knocked over her tea as she snatched the paper from his hands. Are you kidding me? This is a threat, Boone. Boone kept his expression neutral, but inside something twisted in his chest. He had expected backlash, but he hadn't expected intimidation. It's just words, he muttered. Whoever sent this wants me to be afraid. I won't give them that. Izzy wasn't convinced. You need to tell your dad. You need to tell Chief Harlow. Boone hesitated. Going to the police meant trusting the very institution that had wronged him in the first place. But ignoring the threat could be even worse. He had pushed the department for change, and now someone was pushing back. As Sable nudged his hand, Boone knew one thing for certain. Backing down was an option. Boone had spent years learning how to navigate a world that wasn't designed for him. He had faced ignorance, condescension, and the occasional inconvenience of people underestimating him. But this was different. This wasn't misunderstanding or a moment of thoughtlessness. This was a direct threat. And whoever had sent that anonymous letter had just escalated their message in the most cowardly way possible. The first thing Boone registered was Sable's sharp, urgent bark. It wasn't his usual alert. This was different. Boone bolted upright in bed, his senses on high alert, his body tensed. Then, a second later, the smell hit him, the acrid, unmistakable stench of burning plastic. His stomach clenched, and before he could even process it, Izzy's voice rang from the other room. Boone, someone set your trash can on fire. Boone didn't waste a second. He moved swiftly, grabbing Sable's harness, steadying himself, and following Izzy outside. The heat of the flames was immediate, even from several feet away. The small metal trash bin near his front steps was engulfed in fire, the plastic bags inside melting into a thick black sludge. The flames weren't large enough to spread to the house. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a message, a warning. Izzy was already on the phone with 911, her voice tight with frustration. Yes, I said fire. Someone lit his trash can on fire right in front of his house. Boone could hear the dispatcher responding, but his focus was elsewhere. His fingers curled into fists as a realization settled deep in his gut. Whoever did this wanted him afraid. They wanted him to know they were watching, and they wanted him to shut up. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, and soon the street was flashing with the red and blue lights of a police cruiser. Boone stood firm as Chief Harlow stepped out of the car. Unlike before, his presence wasn't just procedural. It was personal. Boone could hear it in the way his boots crunched against the pavement, the way he exhaled through his nose before speaking. Boone, I need you to tell me everything. Boone's jaw clenched. He had wanted to believe that whatever tension his speech had caused would eventually settle, that things would return to normal. But this was proof that some people in this town had no intention of letting that happen. And now, he had no choice but to face the reality he had been trying to ignore. The real fight was just beginning. The flashing red and blue lights painted streaks of color across Boone's porch as Chief Harlow stood before him, waiting for answers. The night air was thick with the acrid scent of burned plastic, a stark reminder that someone had gone out of their way to send a message. Boone could still hear the crackling ember of the melted trash bin, a small fire that had nearly been extinguished, but the warning it carried still burned in his mind. Sable pressed against Boone's leg, alert and tense, his trained senses picking up on the stress radiating from his owner. Boone reached down, fingers brushing over the dog's thick fur, grounding himself. He was tired, not just from tonight, but from everything that had led up to this moment, from being treated like a criminal, to fighting for justice, to now being the target of something bigger than he had anticipated. But no part of him felt like backing down. He had come too far for that. This wasn't random, Chief Harlow said, his voice low, serious. Someone wanted to send a message. Boone let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, and it wasn't exactly subtle. Izzy stood nearby, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her frustration evident. So, what you would do about it, Chief, she demanded. Because I don't think a slap on the wrist is going to cut it. Harlow sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. We're already looking into it. His voice was steady, but Boone could tell he wasn't making any promises. You need to let us handle this. I don't want you escalating anything. Boone tilted his head slightly, letting the words sit for a moment before continuing. So let me get this straight. Someone in this town, maybe even someone in your department, tried to intimidate me, and now you're telling me to stand down? Harlow's silence said more than words ever could. Boone took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was it. The crossroads where he had to decide whether to let this intimidation work or to push forward, knowing full well the risks. And deep down, he already knew his choice. I'm not going to stop speaking out just because someone wants me to be afraid, Boone said finally, his voice unwavering. I didn't ask for this fight, but I'm damn sure not walking away from it. Izzy nodded fiercely beside him. Damn right you're not. Harlow let out a slow sigh, but there was something different in his tone when he spoke next. Maybe respect, maybe realization. All right, Boone, if that's the way it's going to be, then let me help. We'll start with extra patrols in the neighborhood and a full investigation into who sent that threat. He hesitated for a beat. And if you want to take this further to make real, lasting change, I can get you in front of the right people. Boone didn't need to think twice. Then set it up. As the officers wrapped up their work and the police lights faded into the night, Boone stood on his porch. Sable still at his side, steady as ever. His battle had started with a single moment of injustice. One cop who thought he had the right to take away his independence. But now, it had become something much bigger. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or treated as less. And he was just getting started. If you enjoyed the story and want more content like this, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Comment below and let us know what you think about this twist. Do you think Boone made the right choice? Share this video with your friends and help spread the story. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.